Okay. Well, Nick and I decided we should come clean and acknowledge right up front, although with attribution, that we stole the title for this webinar. And for those not familiar with this prestigious and clearly dated individual, John Wanamaker, he's credited with having started one of the first kind of the advent of the modern department store in the late 1800s, and he was also considered to be a proponent of advertising. But there was something that always troubled and bothered him and led him to claim that he believed that at least half of that advertising was wasted. We would argue that implied question of sort of which half and is it exactly half, and is even more poignant today as we fast forward from the late 1800s to 2019. In 2011, Americans took in, actually processed 5 times as much information every day compared to 1986. That additional information every day is the equivalent of reading 174 newspapers a day. So where does all that come from? It comes from the proliferation of channels, different multimedia channels. Every Facebook flip of the finger to go through your feed is bytes and bytes and bytes of information, image, content, you name it. Now, the corollary there is that the amount of content and information and signals in the modern day world that we don't process at all has also grown exponentially. And for anything to be encoded, for anything to be stored in our memory, short-term or long, and to count as part of our experience with a given brand, or in this case, a charity, you have to have paid some level of conscious attention to it. And that begs the question of whether or not people are paying attention to, encoding, and processing our content. If your newsletter went out and it wasn't encoded by that individual, it wasn't attended to mentally, if they didn't process it in any way, it doesn't count as a part of the experience. It is the tree that fell in the woods and made no noise. And to dig a little bit deeper, which is really our aim today, what if it was processed, encoded, mentally within our memory structures? The more nuanced question that gets a little bit deeper than Wanamaker originally posed is, how much does it, if it was processed and it is a part of that quote unquote donor experience, how much does it matter to their future behavior? How much does it matter to their relationship with the organization? Does it matter a little? Does it matter a lot? Can we get more empirical and refined than that? Can we actually ascertain the value of a touch point or an interaction that doesn't directly ask for money? Can we determine the impact that has on subsequent asks for money? So can we attribute more properly, more thoroughly, in a more robust way, which of our interactions and touch points, all of which consume organizational time, mental energy, money, which of those are actually contributing to behavior? All of this thinking and consternation and question raising led MSF, Doctors Without Borders, in the Netherlands to pose an even more extreme and, dare we say it, existential question. What if it's all wasted? So they decided to test out this extreme existential question. And for their regular givers or sustainers, for those in the US, they ran a year-long test, a pilot. The control group, again, these are all regular monthly givers. This is year 1 of their life and quote-unquote experience with MSF. The control group got a sundry mix of touch points, none of which were asking for money. They were all intended to do various jobs, make people feel good, show impact, etc. And then as a test, they ran a journey that looks just like what you see on the screen, and not just for month 1, 2, 3, and 4, but also for months 5 through 12. And the empty white space is exactly what you're guessing. They sent nothing, not a thing. And I'll pose this as a rhetorical, and you can sort of answer in your own head. Which journey do you think won? The one where they put an enormous amount of time and effort and energy and organizational spend into trying to craft touch points that were all geared towards trying to make people feel good, show gratitude, demonstrate impact, or the one where they sent absolutely nothing? Well, in kind of a man bites dog outcome, in this instance, nothing beat something. The retention, which is the metric of choice here for evaluating success or failure, the retention rate for the people who got absolutely nothing was higher than for the folks who received all of that content that was sent. And so they learned at least one thing, that the content, at least some of it, was being processed. So it wasn't that all that content was wasted. Some of it actually registered, but unfortunately it registered to the negative, which is a whole nother sort of subpart to the Wanamaker's original sort of thesis or question or belief structure. The good news for this webinar, for those that are on, is that this is not the end of the story. Donor Voice does not believe, and in fact, we've got sort of proof and process here, which we're going to walk through, that nothing beats something is the answer, that we should all just punt, quit, go home, fire ourselves, and that the best way to approach donor relationships is to send nothing. The corollary to that is that there is evidence, and it's MSF Netherlands and others as well, that nothing can beat something if the something is put together in a way that doesn't benefit from a bit more rigor and theory and evidence around what actually drives and causes behavior. So our argument or premise on, as we look at sort of the fundraising and marketing communications landscape, is that in the rush to deal with the urgent, which isn't necessarily the important, and the crush of additional channels and opportunities that represents to interact with our supporters and quote unquote engage them and fundraise from them, that we've probably unintentionally made things simpler than possible. We've kind of violated one of Einstein's maxims. Simplicity is great, but if we get too simple and we think that people are giving because, or taking some sort of action because we provide opportunity, therefore we just need to provide as many opportunities as possible through as many channels as possible, that's probably resulted in an oversimplification of what's actually going on. And what we advocate is digging a bit deeper and getting into cause and effect. And so for the balance of the webinar here, just to give you a flavor and outline, we're gonna ask you to indulge us a bit on the theory, the cause and effect of what's actually going on with how people process and make judgments about the experiences they're having with us, what effect that has on their relationship to our organization, our brand, and then by extension, what impact that has on behavior. So we'll go through that. We do think that the theory has some strategic value, so it's not just an academic exercise. We'll then go through a bit of the detail on how you go about implementing this theory on cause and effect, and end with an illustration, a case study.
And the good news is that there are going to be things that we say, these are not adding value, but there are also going to be other areas that you're going to see make a huge difference. Double down on this, fix this interaction. And so not only will you get to keep your job and avoid firing yourself, like Kevin said earlier, but you'll also be able to be engaged in work that you know is more meaningful to retaining your donors and increasing their value. We do have one question, Kevin, so far on the MSF example about the
Yep.
sample size. Was that a split of their sustainers?
Yes, they were the newly acquired. It was a big, robust universe in both segments. The findings are not attributable to small sample and just noise and artifact. It was very real and robust.
Great. Thank you.
All right, so we'll dig a little bit deeper, get a little bit more layered and nuanced, and by extension, a bit more complex in walking through the theory and then how you apply the theory. So at the highest level and kind of conceptually, here's how we think, and we in this instance also stole very liberally from lots of academics who have toiled away a lifetime looking at relationships and how you measure those and how they're formed and how predictive they can be of behaviors. And to oversimplify that work a bit, it boils down to what you see on the screen. We have the behaviors that we're ultimately trying to affect, and it doesn't matter whether those are giving behaviors or doing behavior. Doing can be volunteering or signing digital petitions and any non-financial behavior. That's on the far right. And then on the far left is, again, just conceptually and at a high level, all of the time, effort, and spend put forth by your organization to influence that behavior. And what sits squarely in the middle, and this becomes important when we're talking about measurement and modeling and analytically trying to solve for which half is wasted and which half is not, there is this piece in the middle. And if we think about this sort of sequentially for a moment, those experiences, some of them are processed, some of them aren't. For the ones that are, they are going to have either a positive or negative impact on how they feel about the organization. And collectively, that becomes the donor experience. How they feel about the organization is very indicative of their behavior, whether they're going to continue to keep giving or stop. Okay? And what we're really advocating is that we start managing the business on understanding which of our experiences are causing this state of mind, this attitudinal structure around the organization, and which ones aren't. If we start managing the business there, the behaviors will come. So let's add another layer of kind of detail to this, and the detail matters. Although we'll grant it's another layer of complexity, but these are human beings, and it is not a simple answer on how do we increase in a sustainable way and in a recurring way supporter behavior. So we're going to take that prior conceptual and add some more detail. Again, just by way of orientation, we've got behavior on the right. That's ultimately what we're trying to affect. We've gotten a little more refined, but only a little bit, in thinking about charity time and efforts, right? And just listing out non-exhaustively some of the various functional areas or departments that often exist. Okay, all of these are having at various points different levels of direct and indirect interaction with our supporters, and if those are getting processed by our supporters mentally, then they're creating experiences. And those experiences are also another way to think about them is it's judgments on the quality of those interactions. Was it good or bad, right? And so that is, again, for those experiences that are getting processed, there is some judgment. And this is not something that they're spending an inordinate amount of time on in rendering this judgment. It's very quick and often fleeting. But nevertheless, if it's being processed, there is some judgment that's being made about the quality. For those experiences that are processed and encoded in some way in our brains that kind of permeate and get through, there is this next level of cause and effect where the experience is going to, and the judgment about that experience, the quality of it, will affect these three gray circles. These three gray circles represent a measure, a collective measure of relationship strength. So if you take nothing else from this session, just know that relationship doesn't need to be soft and fuzzy. It doesn't need to be opined as some sort of abstract concept. This has been studied to death. What we've done is to operationalize it into a discrete set of measures. But how you define a relationship, how you measure it, and having those measures be predictive of behaviors and ultimately and causal of behaviors is no longer a mystery. We've cracked the code on that a long time ago. And what you're seeing on the screen are the magic 9 questions. It's on a 0 to 10 scale for measuring the component parts of a relationship. And again, kind of working left to right here with cause and effect. So they process some experiences, they make a judgment about good or bad, and then that impacts their functional connection to the organization. This is how you measure it, but definitionally, this is their judgment about whether or not the organization delivers reliable, consistent experiences, right? Consistency matters a lot for a whole host of reasons, and not just the efficiency of your organization. Human beings need consistency if they're going to build a relationship with another human being or a brand. And so one of the very early judgments they'll make at the beginning of the relationship is whether or not their interactions with you are consistent and reliable. And if they aren't, then you're done, which goes a long way to explaining that rather large chasm between first gift and second gift when we're talking about one-off donations. A whole bunch of donors have made the judgment that it's not a reliable, consistent experience. They were brought in with one acquisition piece, and the next thing they receive for them and experience-wise is completely off the mark, and they're done. It has a negative impact on that functional connection, and there is no next step. But if they make the judgment that they at least know what to expect when they interact with you, and it's a reliable experience, and it's largely satisfying experience, over time, there's this second step in relationship formation, which we've labeled personal connection, which is just what it sounds like. It's this more emotive piece. It's a sense of reciprocity, right? That there's some give and take here. That they aren't just a number on the file, that you have some sense of who they are and why they support you, right? All of those things are measured with these 3 questions. So these judgments about experience that they're making, they don't just disappear into the mental ether. They are very directly causing that functional connection and personal connection to go up or go down. By extension, those satisfaction and reliability and reciprocity and personal connection all start to influence their level of commitment. Commitment definitionally is I've got motive or intent to maintain the relationship. So think about any relationship that you're committed to. If you're committed to it, that's what it means. You've got motive or intent. And synonymous with that, or at least a part of all of that, is trust. So there are people who sit on your file right now who are very high commitment to the organization, and by extension, you've got folks who are very low commitment and everything in between, okay? That commitment level, high, low, or in between, has a big impact on their behavior. The more committed they are, the more likely they are to prospectively take actions and give money to your organization, okay? So as we'll start evolving here past theory and get into process and how you go about making use of all of this theoretical insight. Well, one of the things that is probably registering as I walked through that is that you don't have all of this data. So if we're trying to understand, which we are, which half of our marketing is wasted using that kind of that shorthand question, then there's just some data we don't have. Now this part you definitely have. Everybody's really good, or most are really good at tracking and recording behaviors in the CRM, especially given behaviors, and usually fairly good on kind of non-financial behaviors as well. Everything else is missing from the CRM. We don't have any direct measures, at least in a consistent way, of the experiences and the judgments they're making about the quality of interactions, nor do we have any good direct measure of relationship strength. So part of what's required as a way to crack the code and start to answer Wanamaker's question is collecting this missing data. This is data that you need to get directly from your supporters. There is no proxy for it. You can't go buy this in the third-party data marts. You've got to get it directly from your supporters, and that means you're doing a survey. We'll go into how this is very different from any survey you may have done in the past, because it is, we treat it as a data collection exercise. It is not a survey that gives you any answers in and of itself. It's only when, as this visual hopefully conveys, you combine the survey data with the behavior data that you can really start to answer this threshold question.
And you can see this in your own life, in that you may have a relationship with your cable company or your cell phone provider, where in their data, you are making a monthly payment. You are, in theory, a good customer, but you hate that relationship. And if someone were to offer a similar service for $1 less, or even the same because you're fed up with them, you would switch in a heartbeat. It's that same sort of thing here. Who are the people who are really committed to your organization and are going to stick with you through thick and thin? And who are the people who the behavior indicates that they are giving, and they're giving regularly, but would switch from you if there's a better offer in some way, or if their financial circumstance changes?
Yep, indeed. All right, so this is really busy, and we will grant that. But as a sort of give away the ending up front part, there, if you collect this missing data, combine it with CRM data, and then do analysis of a certain sort, you can get to not only an answer that Wanamaker raised, but a more refined answer, one that you actually need to start to make the kind of choices that MSF Netherlands needs to make. There's got to be something that sits between their control and the test of nothing that can beat nothing. There has to be, right? This is output, and we'll share via the case study a little bit more on this output and how to interpret it. But at the highest level, what this is answering is which half is wasted from this analytical exercise where you combine data you don't have that you collect in a survey with the data you do, and getting a much more refined answer than here's the half that's not, as you can probably quickly glean even without a lot of explanation. There are dollar handles around some of these things that are not directly asking for money. Congregational involvement. This is all about messaging under this brand and positioning. You've got customer service where we're not directly asking for money, and yet we have dollar handles. So what we were able to arrive at with this theory-based model of how the world works, cause and effect, is which half is wasted. Yes, which are the things that either aren't registering right in their consciousness, that are all have time, effort, and money put around them. And then for the half that isn't wasted, that is having some impact on their strength of relationship. So that's the reference to those 3 gray circles we saw earlier, and behavior. What's the relative importance of that? Because not everything that matters equally, right? Which is what these dollar handles provide you with. And the ability to see, is it having a positive or negative effect? Okay, all of that is available with this sort of analysis that starts with a more complex, but just a deeper understanding of cause and effect. Okay, so I promise we'll share a little more detail around this and how we arrived at this, but just know that the answer is available. And while this is messy and seemingly a bit abstract, it very easily translates into the sort of planning and testing that can get MSF to an answer on a journey that sits between nothing and their current something, that has a a fighting chance at beating the control, where in this case, we're able to look at that keep, fix, drop architecture that the previous analysis answers for us, right? Drop, keep, fix, and start to assign that to individual touch points. You get to a much more refined answer if we're looking at keep, fix, drop kind of inventory of our assets to develop that next test journey. Okay, so it does pretty easily translate once you've got the orientation for that prior slide to a world that is where marketers and fundraisers ultimately need it, which is down at a tactical kind of touch point level arrayed across time. Okay. So we'll dig into a bit of the process at getting to that prior visualization of identifying which half is wasted and which half isn't. We thought it was worth a quick sidebar to highlight and underscore something that you can immediately make use of, which is that commitment score, that measure of relationship strength. Because there's some tactical value there. It's a necessary ingredient to really crack the code and get to the kind of answers we just highlighted, and that's point in time analysis where we need that measure of relationship strength in order to get the proper read on the various touch points and which ones work and which ones don't. But there is some tactical value in getting those scores for individual supporters as an ongoing thing. The analysis is a point in time kind of cross-section sampling. There is some value in getting those scores at the individual supporter level as an ongoing exercise. What you're seeing on the screen is a grouping of supporters, transactional, vulnerable, potential, high commitment, based entirely on their response to those magic questions. Okay, so we had this universe of existing supporters answer those questions that collectively are measuring their strength of relationship to this particular brand. And then we said, all right, what happens if you plot out those segments, those groups, ranging from very strong relationship with the brand to very weak, plot them out based on that commitment score and their historical value to the organization. And you can see a very linear relationship here between these relationship segments and not surprisingly their commitment score, which is arrayed along the bottom here, 0 to 10. So a 2.7 is the commitment score for this group, which by definition has a very weak relationship, no sense of reliability, no personal connection, no commitment, no trust, all the way up to the other end, high commitment, high sense of reliability, satisfaction, trust, and a 9.2 is their commitment level, and then the value for those segments historically. Okay, and again, creating these relationship segments had nothing to do with their behavior, but we see it's very predictive of their past behavior. It's also very predictive, to put a fine point on it, of future behavior. So the whole rubric here is about cracking the code on what it is we do specifically as an organization to influence commitment and drive up these behaviors. Okay, so this is showing that there is this strong relationship. This is the illustration that really gets to the tactical application. So this is an organization where we collected, just by asking this straightforward survey question, legacy leads, right? And people indicated which response best fit them. 14 people indicated they had already left a will to this organization. 17 people said they intended to do it. 118 said they're considering, and then 145 said not going to do it. Okay, so what's worth looking at here is that we have, for these two groups of people, they couldn't be more different when it comes to legacy. One of these groups is a very legitimate lead list, right? The 118 people who are considering, juxtaposed with the people where you shouldn't spend an ounce of time or effort or money trying to market legacy to them. Now, if we look at their past RFM behavior, so we've got the amount on average that these two groups of people donated per year, very similar. Years they've been on file, very similar. Number of donations per year, very similar. So that past behavior wouldn't have indicated at all who was a good legacy prospect and who wasn't. Now, we also had commitment scores for these two segments. And you can see here we start to get a pretty big delta between the considerers and the never gonna do it group. But even this isn't really getting to the value that you ultimately want and in fact have with this sort of approach to collecting commitment scores. So yeah, this is an aggregate, it's higher, but what you really want are the individual commitment scores for the 118 people. This is a snapshot, a snippet of or sampling from the 118. So each one of these rows represents one of the people in this 118 counts, and we see their commitment score along with capacity modeling that this charity had paid for. So this person, for example, commitment score of an 8, pretty darn high, and has a boatload of money. You should spend an enormous sum, if that's what it takes, to get that legacy money in. By extension, here's somebody who's just as wealthy based on this capacity modeling, and you should spend very little time. The chances of them actually doing this, even though they indicated they're considering it, is really low. And so your commensurate time, effort, and spend should be pretty darn low. Okay, so this is just a little tactical detour to show the value of these commitment scores and why commitment as a concept and as a set of measures is so useful at getting answers on our threshold question about which half of our marketing is wasted.
And we could bore you with slides that show that commitment is predictive of monthly giving, of mid-level giving, of major giving, of legacy giving, all of that. But commitment is predictive of all of those, and honestly, a necessary condition. If you aren't committed to an organization, you are unlikely to leave it at bequest, for example.
All right, so back to the main event here and demystifying a bit how we go from theory to model output to keep, fix, drop insights around our touch points. So as we mentioned, you've got to collect the missing data. There's 2 bits that are mission critical to get this done: commitment and experience ratings. Commitment, very straightforward, right? It's these 9 questions, they never change. The response to the individual questions is totally irrelevant. This is an indexed value or score, and so it's a scale in that way. So you don't pay attention to individual answers, you just roll these up to get to the scores of the sort that we saw on the prior slides. Very simple, very easy. The part that gets both more involved and more custom is those measure of experiences. And you know, for that word gets thrown around a lot, so we should put a little definition around it. For us, the experiences can and should be pretty thought of in a broad and both broad and deep manner. So all of these that are on the screen are, from our perspective, experiences. So making a donation online, yep, absolutely. Having some sort of interaction with the charity in person, whether that's in this instance being canvassed in the street or doing a 5K walk or attending a gala or a ball, all those sort of in-person interactions, absolutely, those are experiences. If they're actually going to consume and process mentally in any way our direct mail, absolutely, that's an experience. Even taking it and discarding it and throwing it in the trash can register on their consciousness, and so therefore that can also be an experience, albeit super passive. And if they're calling in to complain about something with donor service or having any sort of interaction with donor service, email or phone, yes, those are all experiences that should be accounted for if we're trying to get to a more complete, thorough answer on how best to organize our time, effort, and spend. Okay. Now, it's one thing to make a list, and that's exactly what we do as an organization with our clients. Is we get a cross-section of people in the room. That's a cross-section that reflects the various functional and departments of the organization, and getting to this list of experiences. And we've got multiple slides with just quick examples just to really give you a tangible flavor for what this is. But the other ingredient beyond just the listing of these experiences across the various departments in your organization is what is it you're measuring? How do you measure it? And this is where we would introduce a concept that, again, is not our own. There are a bunch of Harvard academics, Theodore Levitt is one of them, who, in an effort to understand and improve innovation processes, and by improve, we mean improve the success rate, because we've all seen the stats, I imagine, about the woeful success rate for product introductions, new products. And so they were consumed with innovation and process, and specifically, how do you do a better job of uncovering customer needs, right? Because if you can do a better job of uncovering customer needs, and the same thing applies to donors, then you've got a fighting chance at being able to deliver some sort of product that's going to meet those needs. And a quote that summarizes, at least in brief, this, it's referred to as jobs to be done. You can Google this and look this up, this jobs to be done framework. And Levitt said, people don't want a 1/4 inch drill, they want a 1/4 inch hole. You could really extend that thinking even a bit more. Let's say hypothetically or illustratively here, the real consumer need is to hang a picture on a wall. Well, it's digging a little bit deeper and getting a little bit more complex and getting a little bit more involved in the job to be done, a little bit more detailed, digging a bit deeper, that would lead you to a product that wouldn't require you to make any hole in the wall whatsoever, right? Which is why you've now got a million different options for adhesive ways to stick your picture to the wall. So digging deeper, getting to the job to be done. The analogy here is the donor newsletter. And I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to me in the call, but there's not a single person who wants your newsletter, not a single one. What they want is something deeper, right? And that something deeper could be multifaceted. It could differ by constituent type, but there's something they're after that your newsletter may or may not be delivering on. And so by way of example, maybe they want to feel as though their 20 bucks wasn't wasted. Maybe they want to feel really good about who they are as a person, and they want to be able to see somehow that their support of your organization is reinforcing who they are. Maybe they just want to feel like they're really appreciated by you. Whatever that is, the newsletter becomes potentially a vehicle to deliver on that donor need. But the newsletter in and of itself is not ever in the history of charitable fundraising a donor need. So that leads us, when we talk about how we want to measure those experiences, I don't want to measure and ask them in a survey whether they received the newsletter. I don't even want to ask them whether they liked it or not, because that is too vague and it's not specific to what should be the organizational focus for producing a letter. You ought to have some job that you're intending that newsletter to do. If you have a job in mind for the newsletter or for the impact report or for the appeal or for the event that you're going to host, if you have a job that it's intended to do, that gives you some real organizing principle for it. And so the way that we evaluate and have them evaluate these experiences is with the scale that you see here. Tell us about how good a job the organization is doing, good or bad. And then we've just got a list of examples that cut across all sorts of categories and domains. So under the broad header of engagement, again, this is just a snippet of the sort of experience statements that we put together for clients. For example, highlighting number 2, using the annual survey. So it's an organization that sends out an annual survey. And so for people who are going to process that at any level mentally, it's creating an experience they think the job of that survey, the reason they do it as an organization, is to demonstrate to the supporter that they value their advice and feedback. Therefore, we want to measure that particular job and whether the donor thinks it's doing that job. So you'll see with all these examples, we're trying to focus on the job to be done from the organization's perspective and then asking the donor whether it did that job or not. And you'll notice that we get pretty granular and refined as we sort of work across these various categories of experience. Donor service, right? How good a job does the organization do at addressing their questions or concerns on the first contact? We know that that is a really critical requirement to reduce human donor support, frustration and irritation, right? I don't want to have to call multiple times ever for anything, period. So it's really important to see if we're doing this job for the supporters. And you can see some of the other nuances around that donor service category. It's not enough to ask whether if they had a donor service interaction, whether it was good or bad. That doesn't give us enough tactical detail to go back and make changes to that donor service operation. Again, just additional snippets here. So all of the different program work, this would be your specific ways to either ask for and reference support that's going to go to X, Y, or Z, or to be able to demonstrate that they've had some sort of impact with their $20 by helping with program work X, Y, or Z. And so you get very specific around the job to be done. How good a job did they do at this? Fundraising, of course, is another place we want to have a set of experience measures. If you do have regular givers as a part of your fundraising portfolio, I can assure you, without even digging an ounce into your specific organization, that there is the very real likelihood that you have donors who are irritated by and turned off by, and in some cases stopping their regular payments, their sustainer regular giving, by the additional solicitations on top of those regular monthlies. Okay, so fundraising, it's not enough to ask, are you happy with it or not? Okay, you got to get more granular. For those that have membership organizations, somewhat similar to what we just described, I can almost guarantee, without digging at all into your membership program, that you have a lot of supporter frustration or angst around trying to divine the difference between all of your perfectly crafted internal nomenclature on what's a member ask and what's an ask that's not for membership, that somehow behind the scenes in the Byzantine world gets them to renewed membership versus not. So again, really digging deeper into each of these component parts of your business, putting these experience statements together and focusing on what the job to be done is. Campaigning or advocacy work, right? Making you feel like you've had an impact on public policy around issue X. For those who are doing any sort of in-person event work, there's a laundry list of experiences that could take up an entire study just looking at the event world. This is just on event day. There's, of course, pre-event and post-event. There's the registration process, the fundraising experiences. But here it's about this list of very specific parts of that on-day course experience. All right, as we alluded to or referenced, this is still just one hand clapping, right? We were just missing commitment data and experience data, but just having that data, knowing whether something was good or bad as an experience, whether they did the job that was intended or not, is not sufficient. That's really not what we're after. So there's not a single answer that is a particular value that sits just in that survey data. Similarly, there's not a particular answer that's going to get you to what you need just digging and torturing the CRM data. It's only when you combine the two that you can get to these very refined answers. It goes beyond the pale and scope of this session to talk about the analysis part and exactly how we model out to get to the answers. So happy to answer those as sort of follow-up. Suffice to say, there's a simple version and a not so simple version. And so we're happy to elaborate sort of outside of the session for those who want more details on the analysis part. But it does require analyzing this data in a certain way to arrive at the eye chart that we saw earlier. And we'll now revisit a different eye chart that will add a bit of flavor and context to in the form of a case study.
And Kevin, before we jump in there, we have a question about what donor, the writer in says, what donors say and do are two different things. Additional asks are frequently reported by donors to be unwelcome, but the extra asks work. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So importantly, when we're talking about let's go back to the fundraising screen for a moment.
And we're at about 12 minutes left, just FYI.
Yeah, so oftentimes when we look at the experience rating, so the job that was done here around fundraising, oftentimes, but not always, but for big mature organizations who are cranking out a ton of solicitations, often these are some of the lowest rated experiences. But like we mentioned earlier, that in and of itself isn't particularly useful, right? It is, to the questioner's comment, a little bit like saying water is wet. If we ask people if they want to be solicited more, the instinctive answer is no, especially if you've experienced being solicited like crazy. So that's only, that measure that we're getting is how good a job you did. It doesn't answer the importance question. And we never ask directly in a survey the importance of something. And if anybody you're working with suggests that you do that, you should run for the hills, because it is a crappy measure. People cannot self-introspect enough to answer the question we really want to ask, which we can only arrive at in a derived fashion, which it's not even is it important in a vacuum, but what impact does being solicited, in this case kind of above and beyond your regular monthly, what impact does that have on your commitment and relationship strength to the organization and your giving behavior? Nobody can answer that because they can't dig deep enough inside themselves to give you a reliable answer. So point taken, but there's that question needs to be parsed out a bit, and there is a way to get to this. All right, so back to our little case study here. So this output, which we saw a visual of earlier as well from a different illustration, is what we lovingly refer to as the retention blueprint. This is for the U.S. Olympic Committee in this case. And by way of orientation, everything that has a dollar figure beside it or is a bullet point over here came from that listing of experiences exercise that we did with them. So we had a very long laundry list of experiences that cut across different departments and functional areas within the organization. And what this is now answering for us via the modeling, not relying on independently just what people said in a survey, but only via the modeling, where you combine behavior with this attitudinal data collected in a very particular way, the things that we're putting time, effort, and money around that are not registering, that are not permeating their consciousness, okay? Therefore, in terms of donor experience, they don't exist. Now, some of these things you might continue to do anyway because you've got some other organizational imperative, providing tax receipts, right? But we should not spend any more organizational time, effort, or money trying to improve on some of these things, like tax receipts in a timely manner. And what you see in this middle column are all of the experiences that do register, where they are making a judgment about the job to be done and whether it was done well or not. And we're showing that that has an impact on their strength of relationship captured by functional, personal, and commitment. And that commitment measure, as we saw in prior illustrations, has a very strong relationship with behavior. So not only do we get to this shorthand relationship between commitment and LTV, we understand how we go about reallocating our time, effort, and spend and focusing on what matters to deliver a better experience that matches up with what they're paying attention to and what's really driving the business. So what you can really take away from this are two categories and the relative importance of these two categories of experience that really underscore and kind of nutshell the shift that the USOC needed to make. And to be fair, this is a shift that was already had some internal momentum behind it. And so this analysis just gave them some ammunition to continue with that momentum and inertia, and also the level of detail they needed to actually deliver on it. But in a nutshell, the business was heavily focused on merchandise and premiums as the way to build a relationship, and very little of the organizational time and effort was around connecting to the team. And what you can see with the dollar handles is the relative importance of these things to commitment and behavior, okay? And merchandise compared to delivering on this collective set of experiences is relatively unimportant, okay? So this sort of quick sort of summary of the juxtaposition of kind of where they really wanted to go anyway, and ultimately what was already driving some of the best behavior with their supporters, where it was very easy to translate that into a donor journey that was better than sending nothing and didn't require a bunch of guessing on the something. Okay, so this is just illustration of how we translated that into a very visual, simple, and ultimately tactical set of journey work. There's some, I think, just tangible visual examples of what that looked like in the direct mail. And as a shorthand, this is kind of the world they were in, whether it was an online offer or direct mail, heavy emphasis on the premium and the product. And as a result of the momentum and the kind of inclination they already had, armed with this insights work, everything switched in a pretty drastic way, as illustrated by this visual of direct mail that was pushed out the door, a host of everything from making it was more expensive, the packages that went out. There was a focus on connection to the team and all of these seminal events tied to asks for money. There was the reorganizing, rethinking of the giving levels and the benefit structure, and a significant de-emphasis, of course, on merchandise. And happy to report that it resulted in the kind of outcomes and improvements that everybody was hoping would be the case and wanted to be the case, because as I said, they had some institutional momentum to get away from this premium heavy kind of merchandise business, but they didn't have, before that insights work, they gave them that more refined answer on which half is wasted, the kind of detail they needed to deliver on it with confidence. All right, Nick, I think that wraps up all the formal part of this.
Yes. So let's open up the virtual phone lines for questions. I do have one, which is the number of questions that are in the survey. It is a more intensive one.
Yeah, right. Good question. So it tends to be, takes about 10 to 12 minutes for people to work their way through it. So we typically administer the survey online. Number of questions can be anywhere from 40 to 60-ish. So it is fairly lengthy in that respect. But we've, as a corollary, we have never, knock on wood, had an issue with not only getting the number of completes we need to do the analysis we saw, but also to have the number of completes be representative, a nice cross section of the organization, and we can affirm that statement of being a nice cross section in a variety of ways, looking at the distribution of their giving behavior and the kind of the category of donor that they are. So there's a variety of ways that we can affirm, as we have in every case so far, that we have this nice representative cross section.
Another question is, what would you recommend to someone as the first step that they should be taking on this commitment satisfaction-based journey?
Yeah, well, I mean, the simplest and easiest, which will forever live in tactical and won't give you any strategic, but it's got some value, is those commitment scores and the value of knowing the commitment score at the individual supporter level. And as you noted, Nick, I don't care if they're $20 donors, if they're given $1 million a year, it has the validity of the measure still holds. And importantly, you can use that commitment score to get an apples to apples comparison across constituency types that don't have the same set of behaviors. So if you want to look at a list of people who are only doing campaigning kind of advocacy stuff, they haven't given a dime yet, right? And compare that group to people who are givers, you can use commitment to do it. Volunteers, same thing, right? And you will find that, yes, on average, your campaigner people, those, click level kind of activists, the commitment score for that group is much lower than your major donors. But just like we saw with that legacy bit, the more refined answer is digging into those campaign constituents and finding the few specks of gold that exist in there.
Great. And I would add as a plug, we're doing a webinar next week about the feedback process and how that works. So highly recommend that. Another question, are short answer kinds of questions ever of major value, or do you want to use mostly multiple choice?
Our short answer, you mean like open-ended, you think, Nick? Is that that question?
Yeah.
Yeah, we tend not to get a whole lot of value from open-end data with the type of project and analysis and commitment modeling we just looked at. So if it's a point in time that we don't have a lot of open ends that we make use of. Open ends got much more value in if you're collecting feedback in an ongoing systematic way. So quickly think of your life as a consumer. You're getting inundated with requests for feedback, right? How did we do with the hotel stay or the airline stay or the online purchase that you just made, right? Or your order at FedEx. Everybody wants to know in the moment, did we get it right? Was it a good or bad experience? In that context, if you set that up as business process, which we also advocate and have product for, then there is value in getting some contextual data around those experience ratings. So if you had a crappy online giving experience, even though you hit the final donate button and the CRM says success, I want some details on that. I want details on why it was crappy, because that can be used to remediate at the individual supporter level, meaning I follow up and I can acknowledge that, sorry you had a tough time filling out the form, really appreciate you giving us feedback, but importantly also aggregate that sort of text data over time, and you'll find that there are recurring comments that give you, in aggregate, user experience data that you should use to refine and change process.
They're also good, I would add, for helping explain some of these concepts to your boss. Some folks react better to the narrative structure than even if you go in and say, if you do this, it will increase lifetime value on average by $8. Adding in the, and here's someone who said it verbatim, helps engage folks.
Yeah.
Have you looked into the relative value of efforts to improve relationships with the highly committed versus trying to raise commitment scores for those less committed?
Yeah, that's a fair question. We've seen that you can improve outcomes with both populations, right? Those who are low commitment, you actually can increase relationship strength over time, and even in the group that's already committed, you can get extra value per donor in that cohort. But the treatment protocol tends to be different. So to improve relationship strength and value for those who have lower scores, is different than what you might do to increase kind of value per donor for those who are already high commitment. And it shouldn't be assumed that low commitment is bad. In the case of new supporters, it's a prerequisite. I mean, that's just the reality of it, right? Everyone if you look at your new supporters compared to people who have been on file for a while, just as an average, yeah, the new supporters have lower commitment than those who've been around for a while, which is nothing but affirmation for that set of measures, because it is relationship strength, and those do take time to build, although a lot of them end before they ever get the chance to build.
And often there's a different strategy for your highly committed donors versus your low committed donors that lead to separate donor journeys. Thank you guys for hanging in there. We're about 2 minutes over, so we did want to end, but feel free to, think we got through the questions. Feel free to send us any questions you have thereafter. Again, we'll be sending out slides, we'll be sending out videos, and hope this was helpful for you. Thanks, and have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.